When an act of pure cruelty against my disabled daughter went unpunished, the betrayal ran deep. Her fingers were crushed by an HOA Karen with no remorse, and as if that weren't enough, the police turned a blind eye to the assault. But the worst of it? My father, an innocent man, was fired immediately for trying to stand up for what was right. This is the story of how the system failed us and how we found the courage to fight back. It was one of those evenings where everything seemed normal, calm, and serene. The kind of evening that lulls you into a sense of safety and peace. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink, casting a golden glow across the front yard of our house. My daughter Emma was outside, sitting on the grass, a few feet from the curb, happily playing with her collection of small dolls. She was only 7, but to me, she was the bravest little girl I knew. Despite the challenges she faced due to her disability, Emma had a spirit that was unbreakable. She might not have been able to walk as easily as other children, relying on her wheelchair to navigate the world, but that never stopped her from living with joy and determination. The world was a bit different for Emma. The simple act of going outside and playing was a monumental task for her. Her hands, though smaller and more delicate than those of her peers, were always busy, maneuvering tiny toys, building worlds in her imagination. The dolls she played with that day were her little companions, each one representing a friend or character in her imaginative stories. Her large, bright eyes sparkled with excitement as she created these intricate scenarios in her mind. Her innocent laughter, free from the burdens of the world, filled the air. And yet, there was always an underlying feeling that I had to be cautious. While Emma's life might have seemed carefree in those fleeting moments of play, I was well aware of the extra attention she received from the world around her. Some of it was kind, gentle curiosity, but a lot of it was judgment. People, it seemed, were always quick to notice her disability. The fact that she couldn't walk without assistance, the fact that she depended on a wheelchair. It was as if her disability alone was enough to make her a target, not just for the usual stares and whispers, but for outright cruelty, sometimes even from people who should have known better. That day, Emma's innocent play was interrupted by the last person I would ever expect, Karen, the HOA president. I had seen her many times before, walking through the neighborhood with a smug, self-satisfied expression as she lectured homeowners on the strict, often unreasonable rules of the neighborhood association. Karen had this aura of entitlement about her. She carried herself with the belief that her opinion was the only one that mattered. It didn't take much to see that she didn't care much for anyone who didn't fit into her narrow vision of the world, and that day, Emma was no exception. Without any prior warning, Karen stormed across the yard, her face twisted into a scowl. I didn't know what had set her off at first. She stood over Emma's toys, her hands on her hips, and began muttering something about them being placed too close to the curb. It was bizarre, given that we had lived in this neighborhood for years without any issues, but Karen didn't like the way things were. She was the self-appointed enforcer of every minute detail in the neighborhood. And today, Emma's small, innocent toys became the subject of her wrath. "Move them," Karen snapped, her voice cold and commanding. "This is a violation. It looks like a mess." I was shocked. I could see the anger in her eyes, the way she glared at Emma, who was sitting there confused, not understanding what had caused this outburst. Emma's hands, with their delicate fingers, remained on the dolls she had been playing with, her face an innocent picture of concentration. She didn't deserve this. No one did. Before I could even react, Karen stepped forward, her hand reaching down to grab the toys. Emma, startled by the sudden intrusion into her space, pulled back. But as she did, Karen's grip tightened, and in the blink of an eye, her hand came down heavily on Emma's fragile fingers. The sound that followed was chilling, the sickening crack of bone, followed by Emma's piercing scream. It felt as though time slowed down in that moment. Emma's cry rang out through the air, so raw and full of pain that it froze me in my tracks. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stared in disbelief as my little girl, the one person I had promised to protect from the world, was writhing on the pavement in agony, clutching her hand to her chest. "Emma!" I shouted, rushing forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emma, honey, are you okay?" But she couldn't respond. Her face was pale, tears streaming down her cheeks, her tiny fingers twisted at an unnatural angle. The pain was unbearable, and she could barely breathe through the sobs. My mind raced. How could someone who should be a leader in this community, do something so cruel? How could they hurt a child? I immediately bent down to her, my hands trembling as I carefully lifted her up. Her small body shook in my arms, and I could feel the weight of the pain she was enduring. I didn't care about the toys. I didn't care about Karen or her ridiculous complaints. My daughter was hurt, and all that mattered now was getting her help. "Call the ambulance!" I screamed to my husband, who had come out at the sound of Emma's scream. He grabbed his phone, dialing quickly, and I held Emma close, whispering soothing words to her, even though I didn't know what would make it better. She clung to me, unable to speak through the tears, but I could feel the fear in her tiny body. As the ambulance rushed to the scene, I turned to Karen, my eyes filled with fury. "You did this!" I shouted. "You hurt my daughter!" But Karen was unfazed. She stood there, her expression still cold, as if this was just another day to her, as if Emma's pain didn't matter. She didn't apologize. She didn't offer any kind of remorse. She simply looked at me, as though this was all part of her misguided sense of authority. The paramedics arrived, and they quickly took Emma to the hospital. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and the constant beeping of the ambulance. I held Emma's hand the entire time, whispering over and over again that everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. At the hospital, the doctors quickly got to work on Emma's hand. X-rays revealed that two of her fingers had been fractured, and there was significant swelling and bruising. I felt a wave of anger wash over me as I stood there helplessly, watching my daughter endure this pain. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to be treated like this by anyone, let alone an adult who was supposed to set an example. I immediately contacted the police. I knew this wasn't just an accident. This was an assault. No one could argue otherwise. Karen had crushed my daughter's fingers in an act of pure cruelty. But when the police arrived, their response was nothing short of chilling. The officer who was assigned to the case barely looked at Emma's injury. He didn't take any photographs of the scene. He didn't speak to witnesses. Instead, he shrugged, offering a dismissive response. "It's just a small incident," he said, as if it were no big deal. "Nothing to worry about. Kids get hurt all the time." The words hit me like a slap in the face. My daughter had just suffered an assault, and the officer was treating it like a trivial matter. I couldn't understand it. This was not a small incident. This was a violent act, and I was determined to make sure Karen faced the consequences. But the officer seemed uninterested. He told me there was nothing they could do. He couldn't even take a report seriously. I stood there speechless as the officer made his way back to his squad car. The injustice of it all overwhelmed me. How could this be happening? Why was no one taking this seriously? My mind raced. I needed to do something. This couldn't be allowed to go unpunished. I had to protect my daughter. But in that moment, I realized just how much we were up against. The system, it seemed, wasn't on our side. I could only hope that this was the beginning of a long fight for justice. The days following the incident with Karen felt like a blur, but the anger inside me only grew stronger. I couldn't shake. The image of my daughter, Emma, her fingers mangled and bruised, her face filled with pain. The more I thought about the events of that day, the more I realized how deeply wrong everything was. It wasn't just the assault that had shattered my world. It was the complete lack of action from the police that made me feel powerless. I had placed my trust in them, believing that the law was meant to protect us, but instead, they had ignored our cries for help. I spent the first few hours in a haze, still trying to process what had happened. My thoughts raced, bouncing between disbelief and outrage. The woman who had caused Emma so much pain was still walking free. She had shown no remorse, and now the very people who were supposed to uphold justice were brushing off my daughter's suffering as though it was insignificant. The worst part was the officer's dismissive attitude. He had treated Emma's injury like it was some minor inconvenience. That look of indifference from him haunted me for days. In the aftermath, I knew that I couldn't just let it go. I had to make a stand, not just for my daughter, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or mistreated. I needed to make sure Karen understood the gravity of her actions, and I needed to ensure that the police took us seriously. I decided to file a formal complaint. The process seemed straightforward enough. I filled out the paperwork, detailing every aspect of the incident, from the assault to the police's lack of response. I wanted to make sure that every word was accounted for, that every ounce of injustice was reflected in the report. I believed that once the higher-ups saw how serious the situation was, they would take action. After all, no one could ignore the evidence, the medical reports, the photographs of Emma's injury, the witnesses who had seen what had happened. This was not just a case of a child getting hurt. It was a case of an adult intentionally causing harm, and no one could argue with the facts. But when I went back to the police station to check on the progress of the complaint, I was met with nothing but disappointment. Each officer I spoke to gave me the same generic response: a shrug, a few words of sympathy, and then silence. "We'll look into it," they would say. But there was no urgency, no real sense of commitment to the case. It was as if they were just going through the motions, hoping that I would eventually give up and go away. I felt like I was banging my head against a brick wall. No one cared. No one was willing to do anything. My frustration reached a boiling point, and I found myself fighting to keep my composure in front of these officers who, to me, were now the embodiment of everything wrong with the system. But then, there was my father. He had always been my rock, my greatest supporter. A former police officer himself, he had earned a respected position in the community, one that he had worked hard to attain. His career in law enforcement had spanned decades, and in that time he had seen it all. He was known for his integrity, for his unwavering belief in justice, no matter how difficult or unpopular it might be. When he found out what had happened, he was immediately concerned. He was furious at the way the case had been handled, but, more than anything, he was devastated for Emma. My father knew what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you, and when he saw how the police were dismissing the case, it lit a fire in him. He wasn't going to let this slide, not on his watch. Over the next few weeks, my father made countless calls, speaking to his colleagues in the police force, urging them to take this case seriously. He tried to get in touch with the higher-ups, pushing them to investigate Karen's actions. But each time he got a response, it was the same: dismissive, uninterested, or outright hostile. My father couldn't believe it. The more he pushed for justice, the more he felt like he was being shut out. It was as if his years of service, his dedication to the force, counted for nothing in the face of this bureaucracy. It was painful to watch him struggle, to see him put in all this effort only to be met with doors slammed in his face. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of phone calls and meetings, my father came home looking weary and defeated. He had been gone for hours, and I had hoped that he would bring back some good news, some indication that things were finally moving in the right direction. But as soon as he walked through the door, I could tell something was wrong. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his face grim, his eyes tired. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. "They called me in for a meeting today," he said quietly, his voice heavy. I waited, my heart racing as he continued. "They let me go. The higher-ups. They said my involvement in this case wasn't in line with the department's priorities. They said it wasn't good for the image of the force. I stood up for you, for Emma, and they made it clear that it cost me my job." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't believe it. My father, a man who had dedicated his life to serving the community, had just been fired for trying to do the right thing. The very people who were supposed to uphold justice, who were supposed to protect the innocent, had let him go because he had shown loyalty to his family. It was the ultimate betrayal. I stood there in shock, my mind racing, trying to process what he had just said. How could they do this to him? He had spent decades working for the force, always doing the right thing, always fighting for justice, and now they had tossed him aside without a second thought. It wasn't just my father who had been hurt by this, it was our entire family. We had been sacrificed for the sake of keeping up appearances, for the sake of maintaining some hollow image of the police force that cared more about its reputation than about actually doing what was right. My father looked down at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. His shoulders were slumped, his face etched with disappointment. I could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the injustice he had just experienced. "They don't care about justice. They care about saving face," he muttered. "And now, because I tried to do what was right, I've lost everything." It was a devastating moment. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the news in our own way. My father, the man who had always been the pillar of strength in our family, was now the one who needed support. And yet, I could feel his resolve growing. He wasn't going to let this break him. He wasn't going to give up. "I won't stop," he said, looking me in the eye. "They can take my job, but they can't take my integrity. I'll find another way to fight, for you, for Emma, for what's right." His words gave me a glimmer of hope, but the anger still burned inside me. How could this be happening? How had it come to this? The system was broken, and it was failing us at every turn. We had been let down by the very people who were supposed to protect us. But I knew that my father was right. We couldn't stop. We couldn't let the system win. We had to keep pushing, keep fighting, no matter how hard it got. Emma's suffering couldn't be ignored. It was time to make our voices heard. The battle for justice had only just begun. The days after my father's firing were filled with emotions too complex to describe: anger, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing sadness. The betrayal ran deep, cutting through every corner of my life. I had always known that the world could be a harsh place, but nothing had prepared me for the crushing realization that the very system meant to protect us could be so utterly broken. The police, the very people entrusted with maintaining justice, had failed us at every turn. The moment my father, who had spent years dedicated to protecting his community, tried to do the right thing by standing up for his family, they pushed him out. His years of hard work, his sacrifices, meant nothing when it came to preserving the image of the department. The higher-ups chose to protect their own reputations, to shield the powerful, rather than do what was morally right. At first, I couldn't believe it. I had always seen my father as a man of unwavering integrity. He had spent his career working alongside the same people who now turned their backs on him. He had earned his position with honor, but in the blink of an eye, it was all gone. The injustice of it all stung more than I could have imagined. But more than the loss of his job, more than the anger I felt toward the police, there was a sense of profound betrayal. My father had been loyal to them, and in return, they had crushed him. In those first few days after the firing, everything seemed to unravel. I struggled to find direction, to make sense of how everything had fallen apart so quickly. I spent long hours pacing the house, my mind racing, trying to figure out how to make things right. How could we fight against such an overwhelming system? The answer was clear. We couldn't let it slide. I couldn't sit back and allow the people who had wronged us to get away with it. Emma's pain was already hard enough to bear. The injury she had suffered was more than just physical. It was a symbol of how little respect her life seemed to have in the eyes of those in power. But now, with my father unjustly fired for simply standing by us, it felt as though the weight of the world was on our shoulders. We weren't just fighting for justice for Emma anymore. We were fighting for the very idea that right should prevail over wrong. I knew I couldn't do it alone. I reached out to people who still believed in the idea of fairness, those who understood the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds were stacked against us. Slowly but surely, I began to gather a small group of supporters, people who had been following our story and were outraged by what had happened. Some of them had witnessed Karen's cruelty firsthand, while others had been appalled by the police's response. But what mattered most was that they were willing to stand with us. Together, we began to plan. We knew that the only way to make people listen was to raise awareness, to make sure that what had happened to us wasn't swept under the rug. We started gathering evidence, photographs of Emma's injuries, medical reports, and testimonies from those who had witnessed the assault and the subsequent failure of the police to take any real action. I contacted local journalists and began reaching out to media outlets, hoping that the public would be as outraged as we were. But it wasn't easy. We faced resistance at every turn. Many people in the community, some of whom I had known for years, sided with Karen. They saw her as a well-respected member of the neighborhood, someone who held power and influence. To them, it didn't matter that she had hurt a child. It didn't matter that she had acted with malice. All that mattered was that she was in a position of authority, and that made her untouchable in their eyes. In the face of this, we didn't give up. We organized protests, gathered signatures for petitions, and held meetings with anyone who would listen. It was slow work, but gradually, more people began to take notice. Our message was simple. The BIA system had failed us, but we were not going to let it continue to do so. We had the truth on our side, and we were determined to make sure it was heard. But the police weren't the only ones we had to fight. The real battle, I came to realize, was against the very nature of power itself. It was against the people, who used their positions to shield themselves from accountability, to hide behind their authority while leaving the rest of us to fend for ourselves. Karen was not just an individual. We were up against an entire system of privilege and protection that allowed people like her to act without fear of consequence. Despite the odds, the movement began to gain traction. The protests we organized started attracting more people, and the petitions we circulated gathered signatures by the thousands. It was as if the community was awakening from a long slumber, realizing that what had happened to us was just the tip of the iceberg. There were others, too, who had been mistreated or ignored by the system, their stories left untold. As our voices grew louder, more and more people reached out to share their own experiences of injustice, of being silenced by those in power. But it was the media attention that truly began to shift the tide. As the story spread, people from outside our community began to take notice. Journalists dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding the incident. They interviewed witnesses, questioned the police's handling of the case, and put pressure on local officials to explain why the assault had been ignored for so long. It was a painful process, but with each passing day, I felt a sense of empowerment that I hadn't known before. I was no longer just a mother fighting for her child's rights. I was a part of something bigger, a movement that was taking on the entrenched powers that had long been allowed to operate unchecked. In the midst of all this, my father found his voice again. Although he had been devastated by his firing, he knew that he had a responsibility to continue fighting for justice, even if it meant doing so outside the very system he had once been a part of. He became a vocal advocate for transparency, for accountability, and for change. His reputation as a former officer lent credibility to our cause, and he became a symbol of the kind of integrity that was missing from the police force. But it wasn't just my father who had been affected by this betrayal, it was our entire family. The community, too, was being forced to reckon with the way it had allowed this kind of injustice to persist. People began to ask questions. They started to wonder why it had taken so long for anyone to care about Emma's injury. They began to question the police force's handling of the case and whether they were truly there to serve the people. The pressure mounted. The police, embarrassed by the public outcry, were forced to take action. The case, which had been buried under layers of indifference, was suddenly reopened. The local district attorney, after facing growing public pressure, announced that they would be investigating the police's mishandling of the case and pursuing charges against Karen for the assault. It felt like a victory, but it was bittersweet. The damage had already been done. Emma's life had been changed forever, and my father's career had been shattered. The trust that had once been there was gone, replaced by a cold cynicism. The system that was meant to protect us had failed us, and while we had managed to shine a light on the truth, it didn't erase the hurt we had experienced. But one thing was clear: the fight wasn't over. The case was just the beginning. The battle for justice, for accountability, had only just begun. We were determined to see it through, to make sure that Karen and those who had failed us faced the consequences of their actions. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been ignored or silenced, and in that moment, I knew we would win. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. Justice had been delayed, but it would never be denied. Our journey didn't end with the reopening of the case. It had only just begun. The weight of what had transpired over the past weeks and months still hung heavy on my shoulders, and I could feel the emotional and physical exhaustion creeping up on me. But as hard as it had been, as challenging as each step seemed, I couldn't stop now. We couldn't stop. Not after everything Emma had been through, not after everything my father had lost. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing. We would fight for justice, no matter how long it took. The legal battle was long and grueling, an emotional roller coaster that seemed never-ending. Every day felt like a battle of its own. There were times when it seemed like we were making progress, and other times when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. It wasn't just the emotional toll of reliving the traumatic events that had unfolded, but the constant pushback from the people, who wanted us to back down. The system, it seemed, was still trying to protect those who were in positions of power, even when the evidence against them was undeniable. But despite the odds, something remarkable happened. The public support for us grew stronger every day. What had started as a fight for my daughter's rights had transformed into something much bigger, a symbol of the fight for justice in a world where the powerful too often got away with the most heinous acts. In the beginning, many had dismissed our case. They had written us off as just another family caught in the crossfire of a broken system. Karen, after all, was a prominent figure in the community. She had power. She had influence. She was the HOA president, and to many that made her untouchable. But as the weeks went on, the truth began to seep out. Slowly, but surely, the walls that had protected her began to crumble. The public learned of her cruelty, her blatant disregard for human dignity, and the growing evidence of her actions. People began to see Karen for who she truly was, not the respectable woman she had presented herself to be, but someone capable of harming others without a second thought. It wasn't just the physical injury to Emma that struck people. It was the sheer indifference with which Karen had acted. The way she had treated my daughter, the way she had disregarded her pain as if it meant nothing. The more we shared our story, the more others began to recognize the importance of standing up for what was right, and the more people rallied behind us, the more pressure was placed on the authorities to do something. But it wasn't just the public that was growing in strength. We, too, were becoming something we hadn't been before, a symbol. We weren't just a family seeking justice for an assault. We had become a representation of the fight against a system that allowed the powerful to walk away scot-free while the innocent paid the price. The case was no longer just about Karen and the injury she had caused Emma. It was about all the victims who had been wronged, all those who had suffered in silence because the system wasn't designed to protect them. We were speaking for those who didn't have a voice, and with every passing day, our resolve grew stronger. Emma, though still forever marked by the trauma she had endured, found a strength within herself that I could never have imagined. She had always been a brave little girl, but now she was something else entirely, a symbol of resilience. She didn't just find strength in the people who rallied around her, in the community that was finally starting to listen. She found strength in herself, and that, perhaps more than anything else, was the greatest victory we could have asked. For she had become a voice for justice, a voice that had been ignored for so long, but one that was finally being heard. I watched her every day as she continued to heal, as she processed the pain and the anger that came with the assault, and I saw something that filled me with both pride and sorrow. A little girl who had learned too early that the world could be cruel, but who refused to let that cruelty define her. And as for my father, he too was finding his path once again. The loss of his job had shaken him to his core. He had given so much of himself to the police force, and to see his years of dedication and hard work thrown away because he stood up for his family was devastating. But he didn't let it break him. He didn't let the system's betrayal destroy his faith in justice. Instead, he found a new way to fight. My father became an advocate for victims of injustice, using his knowledge and experience in law enforcement to help others who had nowhere else to turn. He became a voice for those who had been wronged by the system, and he used his platform to speak out against the very institution that had fired him. His experience was a testament to the fact that even when the system fails you, you can still stand up and make a difference. He didn't let his firing define him, and he didn't let it stop him from doing what was right. His work as an advocate, helping victims navigate the complexities of the justice system, became a source of healing for him. The feeling of fighting for something greater than himself, of helping others find their voice, brought him a sense of purpose that had been missing since his firing. Together, we became a family on a mission. We had learned that justice wasn't a given, that it wasn't something that could be taken for granted. We had learned that the fight for justice was never easy, and that sometimes the system that was meant to protect us could also be the one that silenced us. But we had also learned that no matter how hard it was, no matter how many times the doors were slammed in our faces, we could still fight. Karen's day in court eventually came. The charges against her, which had seemed so distant and impossible at the beginning, were finally brought to light. The assault on Emma, the police's negligence, and the public outcry against her cruelty all culminated in a trial that felt like a long-awaited victory. The courtroom was filled with people who had been touched by our story, people who had stood by us every step of the way. As we took our seats in the courtroom, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, yes, but also a sense of quiet anticipation. This was our moment. This was the moment when Karen would have to answer for what she had done. The trial was long, filled with back-and-forth arguments, cross-examinations, and the weighing of evidence. Karen's defense was weak at best, filled with attempts to discredit our testimony, to downplay the seriousness of what had happened. But the evidence spoke for itself. The medical records, the photographs of Emma's injury, the testimonies from witnesses who had seen the assault, everything pointed to Karen's guilt. And in the end, the judge ruled in our favor. Karen was found guilty of assaulting Emma, and she was sentenced to serve time. The relief that washed over me in that moment was indescribable. It wasn't just the victory in the courtroom, It was the realization that we had fought and won, that we had stood up against a broken system, and had brought about change. But even as we celebrated this victory, I knew that the fight wasn't truly over. The battle for justice would continue, not just for us, but for all those who had ever been silenced, who had ever been pushed aside by the system. We couldn't stop here. We couldn't rest on our laurels. The fight for justice was ongoing, and it was a fight we were willing to continue, no matter the cost. In the end, it wasn't just about Emma's injury, or my father's firing, or the victory in court. It was about standing up for what was right, for making sure that the powerful couldn't continue to crush the weak without consequence. It was about creating a world where justice wasn't a privilege, but a right, where no one, no matter their status, could escape accountability for their actions. And with that, we knew that our fight had only just begun. Join the fight for justice and hold those in power accountable. Subscribe to the HOA stories and stand with us in exposing the truth.